This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to today's Storyworks Roundtable. Robert, Catherine, and I are happy to have Matt Herron back with us on the show. Yay!
Full crew.
That's right. We just did that episode on writing short stories, how they're different from the novel, and it got us thinking more about short stories, why they matter, what we can do with them, how to use them in our work. And so today we're going to be talking about writing the story collection, connecting your stories together by theme, maybe turning out a novel in stories. And the reason we wanted Matt to come on is because he has done just that with his Tales of the Republic collection. And why don't we start with your story behind that collection, Max? I know you kind of changed it from collection to novel and stories, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So that story is like half marketing reasons and half writing reasons. The writing reasons are I started it as a short story, and I thought, oh, it's just going to be the one short story. And then I kept writing, and then there was another short story, and then another. And so I never actually envisioned it as a novel originally, but that's how it ended up. And so when I published it originally as a short story because that's all I had. And then I published a sequel because I had come up with that and with no plan for the future. And eventually it became 7 different installments, and I serialized it. And then once that was done and the sales on it had kind of dried up, I packaged it up as a novel and ended up renaming it. So it was called Tales of the Republic. And now if you search for it on Amazon, it's called The Republic. And it's just a 80,000 word novel. I don't actually sell the individual short stories anymore because it seemed to do better as a novel just because of the length requirements and stuff like that. But it definitely is, like in structure, a series of interlinked short stories from 3 different points of view characters. Right.
And did you ever, when you were selling it as individual short stories, did you also offer it as a collection under one cover?
Yeah, I had that was basically what became the novel. I just ended up taking down the episodes because they just didn't sell as well. You know, like the novel is just a more marketable piece of fiction. People want to have like the whole book. Right. Whereas where it's like, oh, I have to buy 50-page installments, you know? So I did that one. And then the other thing I have is a short story collection that's just, they're all post-apocalyptic stories. It's called Boys and Their Monsters. And it's called that because what they all have in common, and I did this by design, was the main character is a young man, and there's a monster in each one, like a different monster. There's like a lake monster, and then there's like a basilisk-type monster, and then there's another monster that becomes the boy's pet, and all sorts of stuff like that. So it's kind of collected by theme, like you were saying earlier. Right.
Okay. So what I'm wondering right now is, as readers, is there a difference in appeal between a collection of short stories and a novel in stories? Do any of you buy novels in stories? Or do you just... Because, Matt, you don't call The Republic a novel in stories, do you? You just call it a novel.
Nope, it's just called the novel now.
Yeah.
Did you revise your short stories in order to make it into the novel, or did you leave them as stories and just...
Well, so they all happen sequentially, and it's like character A, character B, character C. And then character A, character B, character C. And then the last one is all of their viewpoints together in one episode.
Okay.
So they are related. You know, like you could definitely see, like it would be a really good piece of serialized fiction if you were to serialize it like in a magazine, you know, the old school way. I just think people don't read like that anymore. You know, they don't really read serialized novels and magazines, which used to be very popular in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? Like that's how novels were released.
Yeah.
The first novels were released that way, and they were only 30 to 50,000 words. And then the publishing industry changed them. So,
right. Conan Doyle, he was serialized. I may be mistaken, but I think Dickens wasn't his work serialized
yes, he
as
was.
well. Yeah, so serialization goes way back.
yeah.
Serialization is part of the reason people hate Dickens, because he would write, you know, a lot of that description in the crazy 800-page books is because he was serialized, and so would keep
dragging it out.
Well, the myth is that he was paid by word count.
I've heard that about the Russians, Tolstoy, and those guys were so verbose because they were being paid by the word.
Right. Huh. And it's almost like if the reader's going to be gone for 3 weeks or a month or however long between serialization installments, it's almost like you have to remind them of the world. So there's a lot more like descriptive, because they have to go back and remember that house from 3 weeks ago.
Right.
Whereas with the novel, you can get away with a little bit more because they've just read it 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Or if it's been 3 weeks, it's their own fault, not yours.
Right. At least it's in the same volume.
Unless it's your fault because you got boring and lost the reader.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Then it's your fault. Well, do we read short stories? Do we read serialized fiction or collections? Is that strictly a literary fiction form, do you think? I mean, obviously not with science fiction.
Not in the commercial genres, especially in the indie space. Mm-hmm. Well, not only are there the spec-fic professional magazines, the ones that pay pro rates, but there are also indie collectives that publish anthologies or collections of stories from different authors. And that's how a lot of people discover readers now too, and how a lot of authors market their work is through these collections. Mm-hmm. So they'll either do a tie-in story, or usually you want the story to stand alone on its own, of course, but they would do a story in the same world that they have maybe a series of novels in. And so eventually authors usually come up with, they're like, oh, well, I've done all this marketing work by putting short stories out there. Why don't I collect them all in the end in my own collection? Mm-hmm. So that happens a lot.
It's almost as if there's a return to that early pulp fiction of science fiction. I mean, when Alida was asking, do I read anything? I I don't really. But then I thought, yes, I participated in some of those collections. Mm-hmm. and the things that I have read would have been, the classic Heinlein and Asimov, where you do get interlinked short stories, which sometimes the only connection is the character, or sometimes the connection is a recurring theme of some massive computer behind things that's trying to slowly work things out, and you get different groups of people working on that over a period of time. Mm-hmm. But I think that's because back in the day, as Matt says, they were issued as serialized fiction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some of the challenges as writers that we face working on not just a standalone short story, because then it's all very encapsulated, but a collection where we know we need, the 50 to 80,000 word count, but it's not going to be one protagonist, one setting necessarily. It could be different in each story, in each chunk of that, especially if you're using theme. Instead of a serialized collection or a novel in stories, if you're doing individual stories but connected to be bound together, what are some of the challenges we face?
It's an interesting question. Probably just having enough work on a single theme, Mm-hmm. I have a bunch of odd short stories I can't put in a collection because I don't have enough of them.
Right.
But the post-apoc stories, I was like, okay, I got 5. It's 30,000 words. It's a short book, and it makes a nice collection.
There it goes.
Low-cost collection. It's good.
Yeah. Yeah. But when you have all those disparate stories, once you get enough, they're collected by author. So then that's your common thread is that the author wrote them. Yeah. One of my collections, one of the projects I did in graduate school is called The Herd, and The Herd is a short story with an omniscient narrator. So I'm going through quite a few point of view characters' heads. And then I decided to take each of those point of view characters and give them their own story. So then that became the structure of the collection, was working with all of those people who had been party to the herd and giving them a story. So it was collected around location. So even though the settings were different in each story, it was regional. It was all close enough for everyone to come together on the beach in the herd. So same area, same general demographic, again, because of being sort of localized. And then going with the omniscient title story, I still had an omniscient narrator, but it was different because instead of focusing on a beach full of people, I had, at least 2 points of view I went into in each story, and then the narrator could tell us things the characters couldn't know in order to be truly omniscient, to not just a dual or triple point of view. But these are things we have to think about as writers. What are the rules of this collection? What are the parameters I'm going to establish? Is it with narrative voice? Is it with point of view? Is it with location or theme? Like Boys and Monsters.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And those all kind of took place in the same setting too, so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And as you say, when you're famous enough, then it's just your name.
Right.
So how do you know you're writing a collection of short stories or a series of short stories that you're putting into a novel versus a novel?
Well, I think having the multiplicity factor. So instead of one story arc, one plot arc, one character arc that is the umbrella over the whole storyline, you've got multiple mini arcs. So you could have multiple protagonists, multiple character arcs, and they can be those truncated arcs that we were talking about in the last short story episode, where it's more a slice of life, and that change at the end could be a realization. It could be a very subtle thing. It could be an ambiguous ending where the reader has to walk away and go, well, okay, what's happening here? So that would be a main distinction between a collection of stories versus a novel. And a novel in stories, I think Olive Kitteridge has been called a novel in stories, because you've got stories about different people, but they all revolve around this Olive Kitteridge character. And so it has the cohesion of a novel, but not the arc of a novel.
Okay, so it wouldn't have, if you were writing a series of stories that you collected that was a novel in stories, per se, you wouldn't necessarily have the climax be your 4th story and then the 5th story be the denouement kind of a thing. You have a bunch of different... Because that's what I'm saying, is where's that difference between where it's a series of short stories versus it really should just be a novel?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think with the series of short stories, you'd have an episodic feel to it. So you're coming back to the same place or the same people, the same time frame, but each story could be read alone and could stand alone. It's just they work together. They're linked together. In a small town setting where everybody knows everybody. So protagonist A could be a supporting character in protagonist B's story and vice versa. And so you've got that interweaving through a novel in stories.
Would you call are you familiar with Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club? I think that's what the first collection of hers is called.
I haven't read it. I thought Joy Luck Club was a novel. I thought that was her first big novel. Maybe
I'm thinking of whatever her first publication was. Because I have one book of hers, I don't remember the title, but it's basically a collection of short stories, but they're all about her family life as a child, as an American immigrant child.
Right.
Stories about her mom and her dad and her community and that sort of stuff. And it almost, it's been a long time since I've read it, but I never went into it thinking, I'm going to read this from beginning to end like a novel. I always went into it thinking, and maybe this is just me as a reader, whenever I get a collection of short stories, I pick whatever one looks good and I read that one first. I don't think about it like a unified experience. And I don't necessarily know that I even want it to be, but I guess if the author designed it that way, it could have a different tone.
Yeah. Is it important to read a collection of short stories beginning to end? Are they curated in a way where you want to read them in order?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on the collection of stories and what the purpose is. Junot Diaz's collection, what is the title now? I just have The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde in my head, but that's his novel. Junior is the main character, and Junior is a boy from the Dominican Republic, growing up in New York, but then there are stories where you go back to the DR, and the collection is set up in such a way that he's older as you go deeper through the stories. So it works really well to read them in order, because you do feel like you get a chronology of this person's life, sort of a coming of age story, but at the same time, the subject matter is different in each story. And there are time gaps between each story. So they work really well alone. And you wouldn't lose anything by reading them out of order. But you maybe gain some sense of continuity or chronology by reading them in order.
Okay.
And I've never heard that called a novel in stories. Drown, that's the collection.
Right.
Right. And if you're reading something that's meant to be like an author's oeuvre, then it might be set up in terms of publication date. So if you read it chronologically, you get a sense of the author's progress as a writer and growth as a writer. But there's no reason not to read them out of order.
Gotcha.
There's one more example I was thinking of is Hemingway's early stories. The ones that were set in Michigan were usually the same character.
Okay.
But they were all like individual stories, and I'm sure he sold them in collections, and he sold them individually. But it was like him returning to that character over and over and over again.
Yeah, yeah, and that's like Drown with you, and you're getting the same character over and over again, but always kind of a different slice of life and different issues with family or friends growing up.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Is it appealing to you as a writer to establish a character, but not work with the novel's arc and the novel's form, to just keep going to these like slices of life, these small windows?
I mean, it's always been appealing to me personally. What about you guys?
Yeah, definitely. I think it gives you some scope to do different things, because you're not trying to pin the character into a more global arc. You've got an opportunity to do a mini plot that maybe doesn't have to tie into anything else, gives you another way of reflecting to the reader aspects of that character.
Yeah.
There is one, if people are interested in seeing like a serialized a series of stories from one character's point of view. There's in the sci-fi genre, these two authors I know have this series called Assignment Dark Landing, and it's about a sheriff on a remote alien world, and they have like 17 episodes or in like a season, so they did like a whole season, and each one it's much like a TV show.
Like the TV,
It's they're detective mysteries, right? It's the sheriff solving crimes or like investigating
procedural
things in the town. It's procedural, right? Well, and that's important for a serialization that's going to work well, because you're returning to the same setting every time, but each individual story has a full arc, right? Because you're, it's like dead body at the beginning, suspect in handcuffs at the end, right? It's like a full arc. It's satisfying to readers, but it's serialized because it's the same sheriff on the same world. And of course, there's going to be series threads through the whole thing, but each story in itself, just like a TV show, should be satisfying and come to a conclusion. So it's called The Sign of Dark Landing, if anybody wants to check that out. I think that recently is probably the best serialization I've seen in the indie world happen in a long time. There were definitely a few early breakouts out of the gate, like Wool was originally serialized. Yesterday's Gone. Wool, which became a novel, was originally serialized as well. Hugh Howey's book. So there were some really early successes with serials, but then they kind of died off. And this is the only one that I've seen, Assignment Dark Landing, that has done well in the last 2 years. I feel like when I published the serialization that I did, it was like in between there were like a couple successes. There was like this, example to look at.
Right.
But then the market didn't really want them. And I still feel like in a lot of ways the market doesn't really want the serialized stories, because people prefer fuller length, like heftier novels. They really want to dig in. For some reason, I don't know why these guys have managed to do it, but I think that they are like, so there's 12 so far. I think the length of them is a little bit longer than like novelette, but shorter than novella, right? They're like 15 to 18,000 words, and the longer ones probably run into novella territory. And maybe that's enough.
Yeah.
But like 20 to 30 word short story is just doesn't seem like enough to satisfy readers. And also, if you're doing marketing for ebooks, it doesn't actually satisfy a lot of the requirements for marketing either, and your margins are so low it's hard to sell them.
I think also, the reader behavior has been dictated a bit by the big, the giant Amazon providing things like Kindle Unlimited, where it doesn't really matter to the reader now what they're paying because it's irrelevant, so they can just choose whatever they want. And also, I think you got to be careful as an author not to fall into the trap of, Netflix has really now changed the culture of consumption. And that's fine because all four of us could watch the same 1 hour show and it would take us all the same 1 hour, but we might all read at different speeds. So, when you get the voracious readers, a 20-page or a 20,000 word novel or novelette is just not going to satisfy them. So people who consume, say, epic fantasy want something big. But then you look at other genres like romance and it might be completely different. They might be quite happy with serialization in the sense that it follows a family through, 20 novels and all the various siblings all have love stories. And, and so that effectively is another form of what I would call episodic or serialized. I guess it's not short story, though, but there's still an overarching theme.
Yeah, I think we should distinguish between serialized fiction and short story collections, though, because in a short story collection, each story can be completely unique and disconnected from every other story other than the fact that the author is the same.
Yes.
It might have the same theme. It might all be connected by theme. It might all be connected by location or by character, but those aren't requirements. But the serialized fiction always has a connector between the stories, between the episodes. So that's a major distinction there, is if you're serializing something, there's that chain, there's that link in the chain that connects, that works together.
Where you wouldn't want to read them out of order like you could with a short story collection.
Yes. And serialized stories need to be read in order. Good point.
What about, we were talking briefly about short stories in a series, though. So if you have a series of short stories, how is that different from a serialized thing?
Yeah, well, I think serialization, we can look at the example of, Dickens or Conan Doyle. So you get your book, your novel, but it's coming out to the readers in chunks, through the magazine or through the indie publishing process, because we can do that. And another, a contemporary model is television, where you've got a season will have a season arc, but each episode will have its own arc within it. So you get satisfaction at the end of the episode, but you also get the hook that makes me come back because I want to find out what's next. So you get sort of a layering of plot arcs with the umbrella arc, which might be thematic or character driven, or it might be like the uber villain driven. And then within that, you get the main plot line of each individual story. So that's another way to look at serialization that doesn't apply to short story collections.
Right.
Okay.
Because if it does, if that applies to your stories, then you're writing something, even if you don't drip publish it like a serialized piece, then maybe it's a novel in stories.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense.
That's why certain genres are so good at serialization, right? Because
I was going to say,
like a firm structure that's easy to follow and to give the reader that sense of completion, like mystery being the obvious one. But even in like adventure, they do this in sci-fi all the time. Like if you look at Stargate, a season of Stargate, has like a big bad villain. They're like facing like the Goa'uld or whatever. And then each episode is them going through the gate to another world, having a little adventure that wraps up, like they solve somebody's problem and they come home. solve someone's problem, they come home. But then the series has a larger arc, you know?
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, Buffy is one I'm familiar with. So you've got a series arc over 7 seasons. You've got a different villain for each season. So you've got 7 of those arcs. And then each episode has its own little arc within it. So you've got that layering process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting study, too, if you look at when they take, like they've done this with Altered Carbon and with The Expanse, they take a book, like a novel, and they turn it into a serialized form of television show, right? So like Altered Carbon is really interesting because over the series of, like, so it's one novel, right? And it's actually a series of novel, but the first season of the TV show is based on the first novel. But the novel is cohesive, like it's just a novel, it's not a series of sorts. And they managed to make it feel like a serialization. In the TV show, even though the detective over the arc of the season was still investigating the one major crime, in each one he would solve another little problem, and you get to return to that, so it felt very serialized. So that's a really good example. And then the TV show The Expanse, also based on a novel. And it feels very serialized, though. So it's really interesting how they do that. And you can study serialization if you look what they change from novel to TV show.
Right.
Because they have to make each episode satisfying in itself. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Final thoughts, guys?
Well, I was just thinking about that. There's something
good. Robert's deep in thought.
Something to learn from that, though, isn't there? Because they've had to really work on that novel to then make each chunk compelling. And I suppose that's another way to look at your novel as well. If I wanted this to be to break out into TV, for example, then does the novel have those satisfying act structure, or even more micro? Does it have lots of mini plots? Does it have things where I'm suspending the reader chapter by chapter? Do I have hooks? Do I have cliffhangers? All of those kind of things that keep people turning the page, no matter what type of story. It doesn't have to be a thriller for it to be that.
Yeah, I don't think that novels... I think as writers, we are unlikely to go from a novel to a serialization. We're more likely to go from a serialization to a novel. Like if you're going from a novel to a television show, of course it needs to be, the form has to be altered to that, but to take a novel and then break it up and put in all those hooks and all those story elements you were just talking about, Robert, would be to completely destroy the novel.
Or an interesting twist on the art. But that wasn't what I meant. What I meant was, it's as a writer, it's interesting to think if my novel was going to be taken and produced for the screen somewhere, does it contain those compelling elements? It's another way to look at your story and ask yourself, how good is this? If I wanted to level up my craft, what would a screenwriter have to do? What would a TV or a movie producer have to do to make this compelling in every part of the book?
Be an interesting way to evaluate your middle.
Yeah, I mean,
your
just
middle,
curiosity. Yeah, because as Matt says, they've managed to take a single book. Stephen King's Under the Dome, they did the same thing. They could take one thing and then turn it into something episodic, and even though you've read the book, it still keeps your attention, So it's clever. I mean, they've obviously stirred in mini plots and new MacGuffins and all that sort of stuff, but
I think you almost have to, right? Like to keep engaged that long, you have to add some stuff in.
Right, and that's what I was saying, is that to take a novel and turn it into something like a serialized TV show, you're going to have to do so much more invention and so much adding in to build up other characters, to go with different, subplots, bring things forward. They're just such different animals.
Anyway, that was my final thought.
Okay, good. Good final thought. Definitely lots to be learned across the forms and by checking out those elements and seeing how they work and how they affect you as a reader or watcher. And asking if your own work has the power to affect your audience that way. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Matt. It has been a pleasure having you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Look at those cheeks.
I know, I fed her up good.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.